Las Vegas, 1968. The Sands Hotel showroom was thick with cigarette smoke and the electric tension of a city on edge. Outside, America was burning. Martin Luther King had been assassinated just months before. Riots were tearing through Detroit and Newark, and the country was splitting apart at the seams. But inside the Copa room, time stood still in amber light and the clink of ice against crystal. 2,000 people had paid top dollar to forget the world outside, to lose themselves in the effortless magic of Dean Martin. He moved across the stage like smoke, a tumbler of what everyone assumed was whiskey, catching the spotlight in his hand. The tuxedo that never seemed to wrinkle, the loosened tie that said he wasn't trying too hard, that crooked, sleepy smile that made the room lean forward, desperate for the illusion that everything was fine, that the party would never end. To them, he was immortality in cufflinks, the joke, the drink, the shrug, the song. But the thing about Dean Martin that the history books forget is that the drunk act was armor. Underneath the slur and the stumble was a man of piercing sobriety who saw everything. While Frank fought with his fists and Sammy fought with his talent, Dean fought with a quiet, devastating stillness. The show ended to thunderous applause. Dean gave his trademark mock exhausted bow, set his glass on the piano with deliberate care, and walked off stage before the clapping even began to fade. The audience thought that was the end of his night. It wasn't. Behind the Sands, in the service alley where the neon couldn't quite reach and the desert air cut sharp against your skin, 2 Las Vegas police officers had a young black busboy pressed against the brick wall. The kid couldn't have been more than 19, his white uniform jacket smudged with kitchen grease, his eyes wide with the kind of terror that comes from knowing nobody's going to believe your side of the story. One officer had his hand on his nightstick. The other was doing the talking, loud enough that his voice bounced off the alley walls. Dean Martin was heading to his dressing room when he heard it. He stopped, turned, and walked toward the trouble instead of away from it. What happened next would never make the papers. There were no cameras, no press releases, no publicists spinning it into a feel-good story. But 50 years later, a grandson would find a creased photograph in an old wallet, and the story would finally surface. The night the King of Cool stopped pretending and revealed something about himself that the tuxedos and jokes had been hiding for years. Dean Martin spent his life making the difficult look easy, but stories like this reveal the heavy cost of that cool. If you want to keep the memory of the true Rat Pack alive, consider supporting the channel by buying me a coffee using the link in the description. Your support helps us uncover these lost legends. Now, let's go back to that alley in 1968, to the moment when the coolest man in America stopped being cool. The alley behind the Sands held its breath in the aftermath. The busboy stood there, shaking, trying to steady his hands as Dean struck a match and offered him a cigarette. The kid's white jacket looked impossibly thin now, like paper armor against a world that had just shown its teeth. But for Dean, this moment didn't belong to Las Vegas. It belonged to another place, another lifetime, where the air tasted of coal dust and broken dreams. To understand what happened in that alley, you have to leave the neon glow of the Strip and travel back 40 years to Steubenville, Ohio, where the steel mills painted the sky orange at night and the Crocchetti family lived above a barber shop that smelled of talcum powder and immigrant hope. It was a hard town, governed by unwritten rules about who belonged and who didn't, where your last name determined your worth and the soot from the foundry settled into the creases of your skin like a permanent reminder of your place. His father, Gaetano, had crossed an ocean believing America meant dignity. He'd learned to cut hair in Abruzzi, brought those skills to a neighborhood that needed barbers but wasn't sure it wanted Italians. The sign above the shop read Crochetti's in letters Gaetano had painted himself, each careful stroke an act of quiet defiance against a world that kept telling him he didn't belong. Inside, he worked with the steady precision of a man who understood that his livelihood depended on being better than anyone expected him to be. But the sign didn't protect him. Nothing did. Young Dino was 7 years old the first time he saw his father's spirit break in real time. It was a Tuesday afternoon, slow enough that Gaetano had stepped outside to sweep the sidewalk in front of his own shop. That's when the police cruiser pulled up, its steel blue paint catching the light like a blade. 2 officers emerged, faces that Dino would remember for the rest of his life, even when he couldn't remember song lyrics or the names of his own grandchildren. They told Gaetano he was loitering on his own property, in front of his own business. Dino watched through the shop window as his father, a man who'd survived poverty and immigration and the casual cruelty of a dozen American cities, bowed his head and apologized. Apologized for existing in a space he'd paid for. Apologized for the crime of being visible while Italian. The officers didn't arrest him. They didn't need to. They poked him in the chest with a nightstick, called him names that stripped away his humanity, and reminded him that his place in America was conditional, revocable, subject to their mood on any given afternoon. That night, when Dino asked his father why he'd said sorry when he hadn't done anything wrong, Gaetano looked at his son with eyes that had seen too much and said something the boy would carry like a stone in his chest for 60 years, because fighting them means losing everything. Better to bow and keep the shop. But the lesson Dino actually learned was different, and it would shape everything that came after. He learned that the world was divided into people with power and people without it, and that power didn't care about fairness or truth. It only cared about itself. He learned it in the pool halls, where Italian kids weren't welcome until they proved they could hustle better than anyone else. He learned it in the speakeasies during Prohibition, where survival meant reading a room faster than the cops could raid it. And somewhere in those smoke-filled back rooms, he wrote his own code in the silence between the official rules. You don't bully the weak. You don't let power crush the powerless while you stand there and do nothing. By the time Dino Craschetti became Dean Martin, the mask was permanent. The tuxedo, the tumbler, the half-closed eyes that suggested he'd just woken up from a nap. It was all armor forged in Steubenville, designed to make powerful people underestimate the kid from the wrong side of the tracks. If you acted like nothing mattered, they'd stop watching you closely. If you smiled and shrugged and played the charming drunk, you could move through their world untouched until the moment came when you needed to act. Hollywood thought they were watching a man coast through life on natural charm. They didn't realize they were watching a street fighter who'd learned to throw punches in slow motion, so quietly that you didn't feel them until it was too late. The detachment wasn't real. It was strategy. Beneath the jokes and the feigned indifference, the boy from Steubenville was always watching, always scanning for the moment when someone with a badge or a title decided to crush someone who had nothing. He hoarded his power for decades, waiting for the moments when it actually mattered. That night in the alley, Dean Martin saw his father's face in a 19-year-old busboy, and he decided to do what he'd wished someone had done for Gaetano Craschetti 40 years earlier. The service alley behind the sands existed in that strange liminal space between the fantasy of the casino floor and the brutal reality of the desert night. Steam rose from a kitchen vent, carrying the smell of burnt coffee and dishwater, mixing with the metallic tang of fear that hung in the air like humidity. A single bulb flickered from a rusted fixture, casting shadows that made everyone look guilty of something. Against the rough brick wall that had absorbed the day's heat, 19-year-old Marcus stood pinned like a specimen, his chest heaving, his name tag catching the dim light as his shoulders hunched in a gesture that was half surrender, half plea. The 2 officers had created a cage without bars, positioning themselves with the casual precision of men who'd done this before. The older one, thick around the middle with a mustache that belonged in a different decade, stood close enough that Marcus couldn't move without touching him. The younger officer paced like a predator, his nightstick tapping against his palm in a rhythmic, hypnotic beat. Between them, they'd constructed the perfect intimidation machine, fueled by vague accusations about missing wallets and being in wrong places. The specifics didn't matter, because the specifics were never the point. What mattered was the reminder of who could destroy whose life with a single phone call downtown. A few kitchen staff smoked near the loading dock, but they had turned their backs, studying the tips of their cigarettes with sudden, intense fascination. A dealer on his cigarette break glanced over, then returned to his smoke as if this were weather, nothing more. It was the survival instinct of the service class: see nothing, say nothing, stay employed. The officers knew this. They banked on it. In Las Vegas in 1968, you learned early that survival meant minding your business, especially when that business involved badges and someone who looked like Marcus. Then, Dean Martin appeared at the alley's entrance, still in his stage tuxedo, the bow tie hanging loose around his neck. No bodyguards flanked him. No manager whispered warnings in his ear. Just a man who'd heard something wrong and walked toward it instead of away. His footsteps on the pavement were deliberate, unhurried, each one a choice to keep moving forward when turning around would have been easier, safer, smarter for a career built on not making waves. Dean's presence changed the molecular structure of the moment. He didn't announce himself with bluster or celebrity swagger. He simply materialized in their peripheral vision, positioning himself at an angle that forced them to acknowledge him while creating a subtle barrier between them and Marcus. When he spoke, his voice carried no threat but somehow stopped everything. "Evening, gentlemen. Is there a problem here?" Recognition flickered across the older officer's face like a match strike. Dean Martin, the king of cool, the man whose face was on billboards up and down the strip, whose voice had filled the showroom they'd probably walked past an hour ago. The calculation happened in real time, visible in the slight shift of his weight, the way his hand moved away from his nightstick. Dean didn't wait for their response. The genius of his intervention wasn't in what he said, but in how he reframed everything with surgical precision. He gestured toward Marcus as if they were all on the same team. "This young man works for our guests. Has there been some kind of misunderstanding? Our guests, not the casino's guests or someone's guests. Our guests." With 2 words, Dean had transformed Marcus from a suspect into someone under his protection, someone who belonged to the same enterprise that employed Dean Martin, that paid city taxes, that kept Las Vegas running. He'd made it impossible for them to continue their intimidation without it becoming about Dean, about the sands, about powerful people who might ask uncomfortable questions. The younger officer opened his mouth to reassert control, but the older one put a hand on his shoulder. The math was simple and brutal. They could arrest a nobody busboy, and maybe it would stick, maybe it wouldn't, but either way nobody would care. Or they could escalate a situation with Dean Martin and find themselves explaining to their captain why they'd created an incident with the biggest draw on the strip, the captain who probably had free tickets to Dean's show, the captain who played golf with casino executives. They chose to walk away. No apology, no admission of error, just a muttered comment about keeping better track of where you're supposed to be directed at Marcus before they retreated toward the neon glow of Fremont Street. Dean watched them go with that same unreadable expression he wore on stage, waiting until their footsteps faded completely before turning to Marcus, who stood there shaking, unable to process what had just happened. Dean reached into his jacket and pulled out a fold of bills, pressing them into the young man's palm. Not as hush money. This wasn't about buying silence. It was about restoring dignity to someone who'd just had it stripped away, a restoration of balance in a world that had tilted toward cruelty. The mask of the King of Cool was gone entirely, replaced by the weary, compassionate eyes of Dino Crecchetti from Steubenville, the barber's son who remembered what helplessness felt like. After the officers disappeared into the neon night, Dean did something that would echo through generations. He looked the busboy in the eye and said 5 words that would change everything. "Don't let them define you, kid." What happened in that alley behind the sands wasn't a miracle, and it wasn't a one-time flash of courage from a man who'd had too many drinks. It was the visible tip of something Dean had been doing quietly for years, a pattern hidden beneath the jokes, and the carefully cultivated image of a man who cared about nothing more serious than his golf game. If you traced his life backwards, you'd discover that Dean Martin had been waging a quiet war against cruelty for decades, one small intervention at a time. Go back 10 years to the Arizona heat on the set of Rio Bravo. The cameras, the dust, the crew half-baked under the merciless sun. An assistant director, drunk on the tiny amount of power his clipboard gave him, decided to make an example of an older extra who'd missed his mark by a few inches. In front of the entire cast and crew, he tore into the man, calling him worthless, threatening to fire him and blacklist him from the industry. John Wayne was there. The biggest stars in Hollywood watched it happen. But it was Dean who stopped the cameras. He didn't shout or make a scene. He simply walked over to director Howard Hawks and said quietly, "I'm going to my trailer. Let me know when that guy's gone." Not gone from the set, gone from the payroll. Production halted. Money burned by the minute. But Dean sat in his trailer, reading a magazine, refusing to shoot a single frame until the bully was removed. The extra kept his job. The assistant director didn't. Dean never mentioned it again, not even to Wayne, who later said he'd never seen someone wield power with such surgical precision. Then there was the comedian who died 1,000 deaths on the stage of the Copa Room. It was a Tuesday night when the room was only half full, and this kid from back east had somehow talked his way into an opening slot. He bombed so completely that people weren't just not laughing, they were actively hostile, throwing ice cubes, heckling him off the stage before his time was up. The kid stumbled off, looking like he wanted to disappear into the desert forever. Most headliners would have ignored the smell of failure, grateful that his disaster made their own set look better by comparison. Dean found him in the hallway afterward, sitting on the floor with his head in his hands. Instead of offering empty comfort, Dean sat down next to him and spent 20 minutes dissecting what had gone wrong. Not cruelly, but clinically, like a surgeon teaching a medical student, where the timing was off, where the punchline needed air to breathe. Then, 3 months later, Dean brought the kid on his television show, gave him 5 minutes that changed his career trajectory completely. The comedian would spend the rest of his life trying to thank Dean publicly, and Dean would spend the rest of his life changing the subject whenever it came up. The widow of a sands dealer discovered something impossible after her husband died of a heart attack. Someone was paying for the funeral, covering costs that would have bankrupted her. Then, for 2 years, an envelope arrived on the first of every month with enough cash to cover her rent and groceries. No return address, no note, just crisp bills that kept appearing like clockwork. She didn't learn until years later that Dean Martin had been behind it. He'd never met her husband beyond a nod across the casino floor. He'd simply heard that a dealer had died and left behind a wife with no safety net, and he'd quietly decided that wasn't acceptable. The common thread running through all these stories wasn't generosity in the traditional sense. It was something more fundamental, more personal. Dean understood what it meant to be invisible, to be dismissed as unimportant because of where you came from or what your name sounded like. His father had spent his life being treated as less than human by people who'd decided that Italian immigrants were problems to be managed rather than people to be respected. That knowledge had burned itself into Dean's DNA, creating a radar for injustice that never stopped scanning. When he saw someone being crushed by power or circumstance, he didn't see a stranger. He saw his father outside that barber shop, apologizing for existing. What made Dean furious wasn't ingratitude. It was gratitude made public. When people tried to thank him in front of others, tried to turn his interventions into stories that would burnish his legend, he'd shut them down with an edge in his voice that the drunk persona never revealed. This wasn't about building a reputation as a good guy. This was about fixing broken things because they were broken, about using his power for something other than his own comfort. But here's what makes Dean's story truly remarkable. He never kept score. He never mentioned these acts, not to friends, family, or in interviews. The only reason we know is because the recipients finally told their stories after Dean was gone. The thing about armor is that it gets heavier the longer you wear it. and Dean Martin had been wearing his for 50 years. What looked effortless was actually the most exhausting performance in show business, the constant maintenance of a man who appeared not to care, while caring so deeply it carved holes in his chest. The public saw the drink dangling from his fingers, the lazy smile, the joke that always landed, and they took comfort in believing somebody had figured out how to float through life untouched by anything heavy. But the ease was a costume that chafed more with every passing year. Insiders knew a different Dean entirely. They saw the sharp snap of focus the moment cameras stopped rolling, the way the glass in his hand quietly became apple juice, the way his jaw would tighten when someone on set spoke to a waiter like they were furniture. They witnessed the profound weariness that settled into his face after each quiet intervention, as if standing against cruelty physically exhausted him. Frank Sinatra once observed that Dean was the only person who could be in a room full of people and still be completely alone, mistaking for aloofness what was actually something closer to grief. The interventions people knew about were just the visible ones. What they didn't see was Dean refusing to play segregated venues since the early 50s, walking away from money that would have made him even richer because he wouldn't perform in places that forced Sammy Davis Jr. to enter through the kitchen. In Miami Beach, when a hotel told Sammy he could perform but couldn't stay in a guest room, Dean threatened to cancel the entire Rat Pack engagement unless they gave Sammy the suite next to his. When a Southern promoter suggested Sammy arrive through the service entrance to avoid trouble, Dean's response was simple and final. If Sammy's not good enough for your front door, neither am I. Each stand burned bridges with audiences who expected him to stay neutral, to keep things light and easy. Every time he shielded a colleague from racist treatment, every time he used his star power to force integration in spaces that wanted to remain white, he was absorbing toxicity meant for others, while the world assumed it cost him nothing, because he never complained. He became a human shield by choice, and the accumulated weight of that role was crushing him in ways no one could see. Meanwhile, the world demanded he always glide, never stumble, never reveal what he carried. Failed marriages accumulated like unpaid debts. Women who'd loved the idea of Dean Martin but couldn't reach Dino Crocetti behind walls even his wives couldn't scale. Children who grew up with a father simultaneously present and absent, there in body but unreachable because he'd spent so much energy being Dean Martin for everyone else that nothing remained for them. And then came the loss that shattered what remained of the mask. His son, Dean Paul, dying in a fighter jet crash in 1987. After that, something fundamental broke in Dean that never healed. The man who'd once owned every room began choosing solitude with the deliberate precision of someone who'd finally grown tired of pretending. He retreated from stages, from lights, from a world that had demanded effortless charm while his heart systematically broke. He became a recluse in plain sight, present but absent, protecting the softest parts of himself by removing them from view entirely. Years after the alley incident, a stagehand found Dean sitting alone in the darkened Sands showroom long after the crowd had gone. The chairs were empty, the spotlight dark, but Dean remained in the third row, staring at the stage as if waiting for someone else to appear. When the young man nervously asked about that night with the busboy and the cops, Dean glanced over with a practiced smile that fit his face like an old glove. "Ah, kid, I just don't like seeing people pushed around." Then he changed the subject, asked about the stagehand's family, deflected with the same smooth skill he'd used for decades. But the stagehand never forgot Dean's eyes and that half-light between stage and exit. They looked impossibly tired, like a man who'd spent a lifetime holding up a mask for everyone else's benefit and was finally feeling its weight. The future witness, a stagehand who caught Dean alone after a show, sitting in the darkened showroom, staring at empty chairs. When asked about the alley incident, Dean just shrugged and changed the subject. But his eyes, the stagehand remembered, looked impossibly tired. The thing about moments that change everything is how ordinary they feel when they're happening. A few sharp words in an alley, some tense silence, a choice made in seconds that splits one life into two possible futures. For Marcus Williams, standing there with shaking hands and a name tag that read like an accusation, the night felt like an ending. But it was actually the beginning of something he wouldn't understand for decades, because there was no arrest, there was no record, no mugshot following him like a shadow into every job interview for the rest of his life, no court date that would have forced him to miss shifts and lose his position at the Sands. He kept his job, kept showing up even when his hands still trembled slightly at the memory of nightsticks and badge numbers. More importantly, he kept sending those worn bills home in envelopes addressed to a small house in Shreveport, Louisiana, where his mother opened them with hands roughened by decades of other people's laundry and whispered prayers of gratitude that her boy was still okay, still working, still helping. The chain reaction spread like roots through soil, invisible but foundational. Because Marcus wasn't dragged downtown and branded with a record that would have marked him as trouble in 1968 America, his younger brother Jerome could stay in school instead of dropping out to help cover legal fees that never came. No court fines, no lawyer bills, no desperate scramble for emergency money that would have pulled the whole family underwater. Jerome graduated high school, the first in their family to finish on time, then worked his way through community college on scholarships and night shifts. He became an accountant, married a teacher, raised 3 children who never knew the gnawing fear of eviction notices or empty refrigerators. Because Marcus kept working those double shifts, their mother kept the house in Shreveport, that small shotgun structure with the porch that sagged on one side but belonged to them. She lived there until she died at 83, surrounded by grandchildren who'd never had to wonder if they had a place in the world that was truly theirs. But something else happened in that alley, something less tangible, but even more transformative. When Dean Martin looked Marcus in the eye and said those 5 words, "Don't let them define you, kid," something fundamental shifted in how Marcus saw himself. For the first time in his 19 years, someone with real power had looked at him not as a problem to be managed or a threat to be neutralized, but as a human being worth protecting. That recognition burned itself into his memory, became a compass he'd follow for the rest of his life. 2 years later, Marcus enrolled in night classes at the community college. It wasn't easy, working days at the casino and studying by lamplight in a studio apartment that smelled like other people's cigarettes. But every time he wanted to quit, he heard Dean's voice reminding him that his worth wasn't determined by who held power over him. He eventually left the service industry entirely, became a history teacher in North Las Vegas, spent 30 years in classrooms filled with kids who looked like him, and carried the same weight of being dismissed by a world that had already decided they didn't matter. Marcus never talked about that night, not even to his wife, except once, late at night when the past felt close enough to touch. He kept the photograph Dean had signed before walking away, just a quick scrawl on a cocktail napkin that Marcus had carefully preserved between the pages of his Bible. The cash had long since been spent on rent and groceries and bus tickets home, but the photograph remained, physical proof that the night had been real, that dignity could be restored with 5 words and a stranger's courage. Dean Martin never knew what became of the terrified busboy in the alley. Never knew about Jerome's graduation or the grandchildren or the 30 years of students who learned to see themselves as worthy of respect. He'd walked back into the casino that night and probably forgotten the incident within a week. Just another small correction in a world that constantly tilted toward cruelty. He never cashed in on the story, never mentioned it in interviews, never used it to burnish his legend. The heroism existed in a vacuum, witnessed by almost no one, recorded nowhere, mattering to everyone it touched and no one it didn't. It was Marcus's grandson, Darius, cleaning out his grandfather's apartment after he passed away at 73, who finally discovered the worn photograph tucked inside that old Bible. The signature was faded but unmistakable, and when Darius asked his grandmother about it, the whole story emerged for the first time in 50 years. She told it haltingly, her voice cracking at the same point Marcus's had always cracked when he'd told it to her. The moment when the most famous man in America looked at a nobody busboy like he was somebody worth saving. 3 years after his grandfather died, Darius made a pilgrimage to Las Vegas, standing on the cracked asphalt where the sands had once blazed with light and promise. The casino had been imploded in 1996, reduced to rubble and memory, replaced by nothing, just vacant land, waiting for the next vision, the next dream. He held the photograph in his hands, his grandfather's Bible tucked under his arm, and understood something profound about the difference between monuments and legacy. Buildings fall, fortunes vanish, fame evaporates like water on desert pavement, but acts of quiet integrity are indestructible, passed down through generations like genetic code. The grandson visits Las Vegas, standing where the sands once stood, holding that photograph. He looks at the empty lot and says, "This doesn't exist anymore." But that night still lives in my family. We spend so much time looking at the light that we forget the truth lives in the shadows. Dean Martin spent 50 years standing in the brightest spotlights the world could build, letting us believe he was nothing more than a beautiful voice and a charming grin, a man for whom life was one long, effortless cocktail hour. He never went looking for halos, never sat on talk shows to tell stories about the people he'd helped, never called publicists after quietly altering someone's life. In a town built on self-promotion, he was a man who buried his goodness so deeply that it only surfaced in other people's memories, years later, when they were finally brave enough to tell the truth about what they'd witnessed in dark alleys and empty hallways. The central contrast of his life remains one of Hollywood's most profound paradoxes: the laughing television host who made drunk look like an art form versus the sober-eyed man who stepped between two armed officers and a terrified 19-year-old with nothing but his conscience as a guide. On television, Dean was eternal entertainment, staggering across stages with a drink that never spilled, creating the illusion that nothing in his world could ever be serious enough to hurt him. That version still plays in reruns. The tuxedo, the banter, the orchestrated chaos that made everything look like a joke you weren't quite in on. But peel away that carefully constructed performance, and what emerges is a man who used crystal-clear judgment to decide when and where to stand, choosing moments that carried real risk and real consequence. The stage Dean joked about being careless. The real Dean wielded his power like a scalpel, cutting through injustice with surgical precision. His final years tell the story his stage persona never could. After his son Dean Paul died in that fighter jet crash in 1987, something fundamental collapsed that no amount of performing could repair. He retreated from the world that had made him famous, stopped showing up to events, let phone calls go unanswered. The man who'd once commanded stages became a ghost in his own life, choosing solitude over performance, silence over the exhausting maintenance of being Dean Martin. He spent his last years largely alone, watching westerns and refusing interviews that wanted to package his life into digestible nostalgia. When he died on Christmas Day 1995, the world mourned the king of cool. But perhaps that silence wasn't emptiness. Perhaps it was simply the final act of a man who had given everything he had to give and was finally allowing himself to rest. We need to redefine what we mean by cool, because we've gotten it wrong for 60 years. We thought it was the drink that never spilled, the tie that hung just right, the joke delivered with perfect timing. We thought it was the ability to glide through life untouched by anything heavy or real. But that wasn't cool. That was just good marketing. Real cool, the kind that actually matters, is the ability to stand softly when it would be easier to look away. It's using power to shield instead of dominate, seeing injustice in real time and choosing to interrupt it even when nobody's watching, even when there's no reward except the knowledge that you did what was right. Think about that final image from the alley in 1968. Dean Martin walking away from Marcus Williams, back toward the neon glow of the casino floor where 2,000 people were finishing their drinks and laughing at echoes from his show. He straightened his bow tie, ran a hand through his hair, and re-entered that world as if nothing had happened. To everyone inside, he was still just Dean Martin, the drunk who made everything look easy. But we can never see him that way again. Once you know what he did in the shadows, the spotlight becomes almost irrelevant. How many legends have we misunderstood because we only watched the stage and never stepped into the shadows where they chose to be human? Dean Martin's greatest performance wasn't in the spotlight. It was in the darkness, where character is revealed and dignity is defended, one quiet stand at a time.